Apple is in trouble. For over 2 decades, China was its golden goose, a manufacturing powerhouse that turned Apple into the most profitable company in the world. But now, Apple is scrambling to get out. They're shifting production, pulling resources, and looking for a way to escape. The big question is, why? On the surface, it seems like the perfect partnership. Apple gets cheap, efficient manufacturing. China gets jobs and economic growth. But behind the scenes, something big is happening. Costs are rising. The Chinese government is tightening its grip. And Apple is losing market share to homegrown competitors like Huawei and Xiaomi. This isn't just about politics or trade wars. It's about survival. Apple once relied on China to make its products at rock-bottom prices. But now, that reliance is turning into a liability. The same system that made them rich is now making them vulnerable. But here's the twist. While Apple is desperate to leave China, they're barely blinking. Why? Because China has evolved. It no longer needs Apple the way it once did. The country is shifting away from being just the world's factory. It's developing its own tech giants, its own supply chains, and its own global influence. So the real question isn't why Apple is leaving. It's whether they can even survive without China. And that answer? Well, it's more complicated than you might think. It's hard to imagine now, but in the 1990s, Apple was on the verge of collapse. Their computers were overpriced, their market share was shrinking, and their competitors, IBM, Compaq, and Microsoft, were running circles around them. Apple wasn't just struggling, they were dying. Then came Tim Cook. When Steve Jobs returned in 1997, he needed a miracle. And Cook delivered. His strategy? Move production overseas. China was the perfect choice. Cheap labor, massive infrastructure, and a government eager to attract foreign investment. Apple's suppliers, especially Foxconn, built enormous factories, entire cities dedicated to assembling iPhones, iPads, and MacBooks. And it worked. Apple's costs dropped, production skyrocketed, and the company went from near bankruptcy to absolute dominance. In 2007, when Steve Jobs demanded last-minute changes to the iPhone, switching from plastic to glass screens, Foxconn didn't even blink. Within days, thousands of workers were on 12-hour shifts, producing tens of thousands of glass iPhones every single day. That kind of speed? That kind of efficiency? It was only possible in China. By 2010, Apple was the most valuable tech company on Earth. The iPhone was a global sensation. And behind it all was China, churning out millions of devices at an unprecedented pace. Apple and China had built something powerful together. It was a win-win. But here's where things get interesting. While Apple became dependent on China, China was quietly building something else. Something that one day would make them far less reliant on Apple. For years, Apple was untouchable in China. But then, things started to change. At first, the warning signs were small. A little dip in sales here, a slight increase in manufacturing costs there. Nothing too alarming. But by 2024, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Apple's dominance in the Chinese smartphone market was over. Once the #1 brand in China, Apple had now fallen to third place. Huawei and Xiaomi had taken over, eating into Apple's market share with aggressive pricing and high-end features. And here's the real shocker. iPhone sales in China dropped by 18% in a single year. The biggest decline Apple had seen in nearly a decade. Why? Because Chinese consumers were changing. They weren't just looking for a status symbol anymore. They wanted something local, something theirs. Huawei, despite being hit with US sanctions, came back stronger than ever. Their new phones had no American parts, proving that China didn't need Apple or the US for cutting-edge technology. But that wasn't the only problem Apple faced. Their entire supply chain, 95% of it, was still tied to China. Even parts made elsewhere, like processors from Taiwan or screens from South Korea, still ended up in Chinese factories for final assembly. This level of dependence, it was becoming a massive liability. Political tensions between the US and China were rising. The Trump administration had already hit Chinese goods with tariffs, and the Biden administration wasn't backing down either. If China retaliated, if the US imposed even harsher restrictions, Apple could be caught in the middle with no way out. And then came the biggest wake-up call of all, the pandemic. In 2020, China's strict lockdown shut down factories overnight. The global supply chain collapsed. Apple's production plummeted. And suddenly, they realized something terrifying. They weren't in control. They had built a trillion-dollar empire on someone else's land. And now, that land was shifting beneath their feet. Apple's situation in China wasn't just becoming risky, it was becoming dangerous. For years, Apple enjoyed the perfect deal. China gave them cheap labor, an unbeatable supply chain, and complete flexibility to build products at an insane speed. But then, the winds changed. First, there was the political tension. By 2024, the relationship between China and the US had reached a boiling point. Trade wars, tariffs, tech restrictions, it wasn't just about economics anymore. It was about national security. The US government started pushing major tech companies, including Apple, to move production out of China. They didn't want American companies depending on a country they saw as a geopolitical rival. Apple was now caught in the middle of a fight between two superpowers. And it wasn't just the US applying pressure. China itself was making things more difficult. Over the years, new regulations made it clear that Apple would have less and less control over its own business. Back in 2017, China passed the cybersecurity law, which forced foreign companies to store all their data inside China. That meant Apple had to hand over data storage to a government-affiliated company. Not exactly a comforting thought for a company built on privacy and security. Then, in 2021, China passed the anti-foreign sanctions law. If Apple followed US sanctions against China, China could legally punish them for it. They were being pulled in two different directions, and either way, there would be consequences. And just when Apple thought things couldn't get any worse, China revised its company law in 2024. This new rule stated that any foreign business with more than 300 employees in China had to put a Chinese representative on their board of directors. That was the final warning sign. Apple was no longer just a guest in China. They were being forced to play by new rules, rules that gave China more control over their business. And then there was the issue of cost. Apple originally moved to China because it was cheap, but those days were over. Back in 2001, when Apple first set up production, the average annual wage in China was around $1,100. By 2024, it had more than doubled. China wasn't the land of ultra-cheap labor anymore. Its workers were getting richer, more skilled, and frankly, less interested in doing factory work. A new generation of Chinese workers didn't want to spend 12-hour shifts assembling iPhones. They wanted better jobs in tech, finance, and other fast-growing industries. At the same time, China itself was shifting. Instead of relying on foreign companies like Apple, it was investing in its own brands. Huawei, Xiaomi, opposite. Once upon a time, Apple ruled the Chinese smartphone market. But now, these domestic brands were taking over and Apple's market share was collapsing. But nothing hit Apple harder than what happened in 2020. The pandemic was the final wake-up call. When COVID hit, China enforced some of the strictest lockdowns in the world. Foxconn's factories were suddenly shut down. Thousands of workers were forced to live inside the factories. Others walked off the job entirely. Apple's production plummeted. The iPhone 14 launch? Delayed. For the first time, Apple saw just how fragile its reliance on China really was. A single government decision, one lockdown, one policy change, could shut them down overnight. And that was unacceptable. Apple had no choice. They had to leave, not all at once, not overnight. But they needed a backup plan. Fast. Because for the first time in decades, Apple realized China didn't need them, but they still needed China. And that had to change. So Apple is trying to leave. But here's the twist. China isn't begging them to stay. In the past, losing Apple would have been a disaster. Apple's presence brought jobs, investments, and global attention. But today, China has outgrown Apple. The country is no longer just the world's factory. It's becoming a tech powerhouse in its own right. Think about this. Back in the 2000s, Chinese companies weren't seen as serious competitors in high-end tech. But fast forward to today, and Huawei, Xiaomi, and other local brands are not just competing with Apple. They're beating them. Huawei's latest smartphone, built without American parts. It's a direct challenge to Apple, and it's working. More and more Chinese consumers are ditching iPhones for homegrown alternatives. And that's exactly what China wants. The government has been pushing for self-reliance in technology for years. The goal? Reduce dependence on American companies like Apple and build a future powered by Chinese innovation. That's why China isn't panicking. Apple leaving isn't a loss, it's an opportunity. And it's not just about smartphones. China has been shifting away from low-cost manufacturing for years. Wages are rising, education levels are increasing, and the country is investing heavily in AI, semiconductors, and automation. Apple's departure? It's just another step in China's long-term strategy. And here's the real kicker. China still holds the cards. Even though Apple is moving some production to places like India, they can't just walk away from China. Over 95% of Apple's supply chain is still tied to the country. Many of their components, whether it's batteries, camera modules, or chips, are still made or assembled in China. So while Apple wants to leave, they can't fully escape. Not yet. But this shift is happening. Apple is diversifying. China is moving on. And the global manufacturing landscape is changing faster than ever. The question now is, where will Apple go next? Apple knows it can't afford to keep all its eggs in one basket. So if China is no longer the best option, where next? The answer? India. Over the last few years, Apple has been quietly shifting production to India, pouring billions of dollars into the country. And it's not just Apple. Foxconn, Apple's biggest manufacturing partner, is expanding there too. Why India? Simple. It's got a huge workforce, lower labor costs, and a government that's rolling out the red carpet. In 2020, India launched the Production-Linked Incentive Program, which offers cash incentives to companies that manufacture locally. The more Apple produces in India, the more money they get back. And guess what? It's working. In 2024, 14% of all iPhones were made in India. That's still a small fraction compared to China, but it's growing fast. Some analysts predict that within 5 years, India's iPhone production could match China's. But here's the catch. It could take 10 to 15 years before India reaches the same level of efficiency. China's infrastructure, supply chains, and experience in high-end manufacturing are still leagues ahead. Moving production isn't just about building factories. It's about building an entire ecosystem. And that takes time. So Apple isn't betting everything on India just yet. They're also spreading production across multiple countries. Vietnam, Malaysia, and even Mexico are starting to play a role. It's not about replacing China with one country. It's about creating a global web of suppliers. And while Apple is diversifying, one thing is clear. Their goal isn't just to leave China, it's to make sure they're never this dependent on one country again. But at the end of the day, China still holds the biggest piece of Apple's supply chain. And no matter how fast Apple moves, breaking free completely, that's going to take years. For decades, Apple and China were inseparable. Apple needed China's factories. China needed Apple's investments. It was a partnership that built a trillion-dollar empire. But now, that relationship is changing. Apple is trying to leave, but not because China is failing them. They're leaving because China has outgrown them. Labor is more expensive. The government is more controlling. And Chinese brands like Huawei and Xiaomi are proving that Apple isn't the future of China's tech industry. China is. Meanwhile, Apple is scrambling. They're expanding in India, Vietnam, and beyond. But no matter where they go, it will take years to match what China built. So here's the real question. Who really needs who? Apple might think they're moving on from China, but the truth is, they can't survive without it. And China? They'll be just fine without Apple. Because at the end of the day, China isn't just making products anymore. They're making the future.